The silence in the house was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, and the ghost of a closing door. Arthur stood in the center of the living room, a solitary pillar in an empty space that screamed with the echoes of a life packed into cardboard boxes and sold to strangers. His feet, planted on the bare hardwood floor, could feel the phantom impression of the old rug, a geography of memory his son had so eagerly erased. On the polished granite of the kitchen island, a single sheet of white paper sat, stark and clinical. It was a gravestone for a relationship. Arthur already knew what it said. He had felt the words in his son's hug the day before, a brittle, hurried embrace that smelled of feigned gratitude and the metallic tang of finality. He had seen them in the quick, averted gaze as Leo took the cashier's check for $550,000, the entire sum of Arthur's 68 years of labor, the liquidated soul of this very house. Now the words were there in black ink, a cruel, looping script that felt like a mockery of the penmanship he had tried to teach the boy so long ago. "Goodbye, Pauper." Just 2 words. An epitaph for a father, written by his son. Arthur reached out a hand, his fingers, thick and calloused from a lifetime of shaping wood, hovering over the note. He didn't touch it. Touching it would make it real, and for a moment longer, he wanted to exist in the quiet shock before the pain. To them, to his son, he was just an old man, a relic of a bygone era who smelled of sawdust and quiet disappointment. But what Leo didn't know, what the world had long forgotten, was that the hands that built this house could have built empires. The mind that Leo saw as slow and simple had once drafted blueprints that reshaped the digital world. He was a pauper by choice, a king in self-imposed exile. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of a choice made long ago, a vow of humility that his own blood had mistaken for weakness. Welcome back to our channel, where we delve into the stories that remind us that the greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight, and true strength rarely needs to announce itself. If you believe that honor is a currency more valuable than gold, take a moment to support our community by liking this video and subscribing for more tales that challenge the way we see the world. Arthur finally let his hand fall. He didn't pick up the note. He didn't need to. The words were already burned into his mind. He turned his back on the island, on the house, on the life he had just sacrificed on the altar of a son's love he now realized had never truly existed. He walked towards the door, his limp, a subtle reminder of an old, forgotten debt, the only companion he had left. The sun cast his long shadow before him, the silhouette of a man who had given everything and was now, officially, nothing. A pauper. But as he stepped out into the world, a world that would now judge him solely on his empty pockets, a quiet resolve settled in his chest. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and the final chapter would not be written by his son. It would be written by the truth, a truth that had been sleeping for 30 years, waiting for a reason to awaken. The boy had called him a pauper. He would soon learn just how expensive that mistake was. This was not the end of Arthur's story. It was the beginning of Leo's education. An education in the true meaning of wealth and the crushing cost of disrespect. The world had forgotten Arthur Vance. It was about to be reminded. Arthur's life was a study in quietude and routine, a gentle rhythm composed in the key of simplicity. He lived in a small, 2-bedroom house he had built with his own hands 30 years prior, a testament to a skill that was both profound and profoundly underestimated. The air inside always carried the faint, clean scent of cedar and sawdust, a perfume that clung to his flannel shirts and settled deep into the grain of the worn furniture. His hands were his biography. They were large, mapped with a network of pale scars and thickened calluses, the pads of his fingers firm from a lifetime of conversation with wood, metal, and machinery. Yet, they moved with a surprising grace, whether he was fixing a neighbor's loose porch railing or patiently tending to the small vegetable garden in his backyard. He was a retired carpenter, he told people. It was the simplest explanation, a convenient shorthand for a life he had intentionally edited for public consumption. His son, Leo, had grown up in the shadow of this simplicity and resented it with every fiber of his being. Leo was a product of a different age, an era of curated identities and performative success. His world was reflected in the glossy screen of his smartphone, a universe of influencers, brand names, and fleeting digital applause. He saw his father's quiet life not as a choice, but as a failure. "Dad, why don't you ever want more?" he'd ask, his tone a familiar cocktail of frustration and pity, as Arthur sat on the porch, contentedly watching the sunset. "This is more," Arthur would reply, his voice calm, gesturing to the fading light, the chirping crickets, the scent of jasmine from the neighbor's yard. To Leo, this was incomprehensible, a philosophical riddle he had no interest in solving. He saw the worn-out work boots, not the miles of purpose they had walked. He saw the simple, home-cooked meals, not the love stirred into them. He saw a pauper, long before he had the audacity to write it down. Their conversations were a constant, gentle collision of two different realities. "I saw this new watch online, Dad," Leo would say, showing him a picture of a gaudy, gold-plated timepiece. "It's only $5,000. It's an investment in your image." Arthur would glance at the screen, then down at his own wrist, where a simple, steel-cased watch with a worn leather strap had sat for 40 years. It had no brand name visible, its face scratched from 1,000 forgotten jobs. "This one still tells time, son," he'd say, a statement of fact that Leo would hear as an accusation of his own shallow values. The resentment festered. It grew into a quiet contempt that Arthur chose to ignore, hoping it was a phase, a youthful folly that time and maturity would erode. But it only hardened. The setup for the final, heartbreaking act began on a Tuesday. Leo came to him, his face a carefully constructed mask of desperation and filial duty. He spoke of a once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity, a tech startup that was guaranteed to make him a millionaire. All he needed was capital, a significant amount. He didn't ask for money directly. He was more cunning than that. He lamented his fate, cursed his lack of a real inheritance, and spoke of the shame he felt being the son of a simple carpenter, while his peers were being bankrolled by their wealthy families. Every word was a carefully sharpened knife, aimed at the softest parts of his father's heart. Arthur listened, his face impassive, but his mind was a whirlwind. He saw the greed shimmering behind the boy's eyes, the cold calculation in his manufactured tears. And yet, this was his son. The small boy he had taught to ride a bike, the teenager whose heart he had mended after his first breakup. A part of him, the stubborn, foolish part that belonged only to a father, clung to a desperate hope. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe if he gave Leo the thing he worshipped most, money, it would finally free the boy from his bitterness. Maybe it would be the grand gesture that would finally bridge the chasm between them. The decision, when it came, felt both insane and inevitable. He would sell the house. He would liquidate his entire world and hand it to his son. It would be the ultimate test, the final, desperate roll of the dice. He would become a pauper to see if his son could become a man. That week, as he met with the realtor, a young woman who couldn't hide her surprise at the old man's decision to sell the house he so clearly loved, he felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were watching a movie of someone else's life. He was a ghost in his own home, cataloging memories as he packed away a lifetime of quiet dignity into anonymous brown boxes. The world was about to see him as his son did. A man with nothing. The decision to sell the house settled into Arthur's bones like a winter chill. It was a cold, hard finality, a surgical amputation of his past in a desperate bid for his son's future. The process itself was a series of small, quiet surrenders. He met with a cheerful, young real estate agent named Chloe, who spoke in a rapid-fire language of market values, curb appeal, and closing costs. She saw a simple, elderly man making a practical decision, perhaps downsizing for his golden years. She couldn't see the tectonic plates of a life shifting beneath his calm exterior. "You've kept the place in amazing condition, Mr. Vance," she said, running a hand over a perfectly joined corner of a door frame. "The craftsmanship is incredible." Arthur just nodded. "I had a lot of time," he said, the words carrying a weight she couldn't possibly comprehend. Packing was the hardest part. Each object he touched was a landmine of memory. A small, hand-carved rocking horse from Leo's 3rd birthday, its paint worn smooth by tiny hands. A framed photo of his late wife, her smile a beacon from a life that felt a million miles away. He packed them all into boxes, taping them shut, sealing away the ghosts one by one. Leo, for his part, was conspicuously absent during this process, citing the demands of his pre-launch startup phase. In truth, he couldn't stand the sight of his father's quiet sorrow. It was an inconvenience, a messy emotional transaction he preferred to avoid. He just wanted the clean, simple number on the check at the end. The house sold quickly. It was a solid, honest structure in a desirable neighborhood, a testament to the enduring value of things built with care. The day of the closing, Arthur sat in a sterile law office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and fresh ink. He signed his name over and over, each signature a small death, a relinquishing of a piece of his identity. When it was done, he was handed a cashier's check. $550,712.43. The sum total of his visible, tangible world. He drove to the bank, the check resting on the passenger's seat like a loaded weapon. This was the moment. The point of no return. He had called Leo, who agreed to meet him there, his voice buzzing with an electric, barely contained excitement. Inside the bank, the air was cool and quiet. Arthur waited on a polished bench, the check in a simple manila envelope on his lap. He saw Leo stride in, wearing a new jacket Arthur didn't recognize, his hair perfectly styled. He looked like a man on his way to a coronation. "Hey, Dad," Leo said, his smile wide and bright, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes were fixed on the envelope. They sat down with a personal banker, a young woman named Sarah. She was professional and efficient, but she couldn't help but notice the strange dynamic between the two men. The father, with his sad, deep-set eyes and quiet dignity, and the son, vibrating with a raw, rapacious energy. Arthur slid the envelope across the desk to Leo. "It's all there," he said, his voice steady. Leo opened it, and a low whistle escaped his lips as he saw the number on the check. For a moment, his mask slipped. A look of pure, triumphant greed flashed across his face before he replaced it with a more socially acceptable expression of awe. "Dad, I don't know what to say," he stammered, putting on a show for the banker. This is everything." Arthur looked at his son, searching for a flicker of something real, a glint of genuine love or gratitude. He found nothing, only the reflection of the check's value in his son's pupils. "Just be a good man, Leo," Arthur said softly. "Build something that lasts." Leo, busy with the paperwork to deposit the colossal sum into his own account, just nodded absently. "Of course, Dad. I'm going to make you so proud." The transaction was completed. The numbers shifted from one life to another on a computer screen. As they stood to leave, Leo gave Arthur that brittle, hollow hug. "I'll call you tomorrow, Dad. Once I've sorted things with my new partners." Arthur knew he wouldn't. He watched his son walk out of the bank, a bounce in his step, never once looking back. He was a wealthy man now, and Arthur was not. Sarah, the banker, watched the old man stand there for a long moment, a solitary, forgotten figure in the grand lobby. She felt an inexplicable pang of sadness for him, a sense that she had just witnessed not a transfer of wealth, but a theft of something far more precious. The first morning of Arthur's new life dawned through the thin, polyester curtains of a roadside motel room. The light was a flat, indifferent gray, illuminating a space devoid of personality or warmth. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a harsh chemical cocktail that was the antithesis of the cedar and sawdust of his home. He had woken with a start, his body still attuned to the old rhythms, expecting the familiar weight of his quilt, the gentle creak of the floorboards. Instead, he found himself in this sterile box, a stranger in his own life. For a moment, he felt a disorienting panic, a profound sense of loss that was almost physical, as if a limb had been amputated in his sleep. He sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the silence of the room amplifying the roaring in his ears. It was then that his mind, no longer clouded by a desperate father's hope, delivered the cold, hard truth with brutal clarity. Leo was not going to call. The promise was a lie, a final, polite closing of a door he had no intention of ever opening again. It was this thought that propelled him out of the motel and back to the house. He didn't know why. Maybe to see it one last time, to stand on the curb and say a proper goodbye. Maybe a foolish, flickering part of him thought Leo might be there, overcome with remorse. He drove his old, reliable pickup truck, now his only significant possession, through streets that were once his own. When he arrived, he saw Leo's car was gone. The house looked empty. Not just vacant, but hollowed out, as if a soul had departed. He used the spare key he still carried, a small, brass memory in his pocket. The lock turned, and he stepped inside. And there it was. On the kitchen island where he and his wife had shared 1,000 cups of coffee, where Leo had done his homework as a child, sat the single sheet of paper. The note. "Goodbye, Pauper." The two words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Pauper. It wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict. A final judgment delivered by his own son. It was the complete and utter negation of his existence, of his sacrifice. In that single, cruel word, Leo had not only taken the money, he had taken his father's history, his love, his very identity, and declared it all worthless. The pain was sharp and blinding, but beneath it, something else began to stir. A cold, hard anger. An anger not just at Leo, but at himself. For being so blind. for allowing his love for the idea of his son to eclipse the reality of the man he had become. He finally left the house, leaving the note where it lay. He drove away without looking back. The first challenge of his new life came swiftly. He needed a place to live, a simple room. He found a listing for a small apartment above a shop. The landlord, a portly man with a suspicious squint named Mr. Henderson, looked him up and down, his gaze lingering on Arthur's worn flannel shirt and work-worn hands. "You got a job?" Henderson asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "Not at the moment," Arthur said. "First and last month's rent? Security deposit?" Henderson pressed, already knowing the answer. "I have cash for the first month," Arthur said honestly, having kept only a few $100s for himself from the sale. Henderson let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, that's what they all say. Look, Pop, I'm not running a charity here. No job, no references, no apartment. Move along." The dismissal was a small thing, a minor indignity, but it was the first stone cast in what Arthur knew would be a barrage of similar judgments. He was no longer Arthur Vance, skilled craftsman and homeowner. He was now just an old man with nothing. A pauper. The world was now showing him exactly how it treated such men. It was a harsh lesson, but one Arthur absorbed with a stoic calm. The anger he felt was a cold, clean thing. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of youth, but the slow-burning, high-temperature fire of a forge. It was an energy he would need. This new world, this cruel, indifferent world, was a crucible, and Arthur Vance had been forged in fire before. He would not break. The next few weeks were a descent into a world Arthur had only ever observed from a distance. A world of institutional gray walls, long lines, and the quiet desperation of those living on the margins. His small cash reserve dwindled with alarming speed, spent on cheap motel rooms and diner meals that tasted of loneliness. The moment he had been dreading finally arrived. He had to seek help. He found himself at the county social services office, a large, impersonal brick building that seemed to absorb the hope of everyone who entered. The waiting room was a tableau of quiet suffering. Young mothers with tired eyes, men his own age with faces etched with worry, all waiting for their name to be called, for a stranger behind a plexiglass window to pass judgment on their lives. Arthur took a number and sat down, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He was an island of stillness in a sea of anxious fidgeting. He endured the condescending glances, the hushed whispers, the palpable sense of shared failure that hung in the air. After a 2-hour wait, his number was called. He approached the window, behind which sat a woman with a severe haircut and an expression of profound boredom. Her nameplate read Doris. "Name?" she asked, not looking up from her computer screen. "Arthur Vance," he replied. Her fingers clacked on the keyboard. "Date of birth?" He gave it. "Address?" "I don't currently have one," he said. Her head snapped up, her eyes finally meeting his. They were cold and accusatory. "No address? Where did you sleep last night?" "The Starlight Motel." "And the night before?" "The same." "Assets?" Doris continued, her tone becoming sharper, more interrogative. "Any bank accounts? Property? Vehicle?" "I have a truck. A 1998 Ford." "No savings?" "No." "You recently sold a property." 512 Oak Street, she said, her eyes narrowing. "The system shows a sale for over $500,000 just last month." "Where is that money, Mr. Vance?" The question was an accusation. He was a cheat, a scammer trying to game the system. Arthur looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I gave it away," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Doris leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing on her lips. "You gave it away. You gave $500,000 away, and now you're here asking for a handout. Is that what you're telling me?" "Yes," Arthur said. There was no point in explaining. The truth was too outlandish for a form, too complex for a bureaucrat. "To whom?" she pressed. "My son." Doris let out a sigh of pure, theatrical exasperation. "Mr. Vance, we are very busy here. We don't have time for ridiculous stories. I'm going to need bank statements, a gift affidavit, a notarized letter from your son. Without proof, I can't process any application for assistance." It was a dismissal, a bureaucratic wall he had no way of climbing. He was being punished for a sacrifice she couldn't comprehend. As he turned to leave, defeated for the moment, he saw a familiar face sitting in the waiting area. It was Sarah, the young banker who had processed the check. She was on her lunch break, visiting a friend who worked in the building. Her eyes met Arthur's, and she saw the raw humiliation in them. She saw the proud, dignified man from the bank, now looking lost and broken in this place of last resort. Her heart sank. A wave of guilt washed over her. She had been a party to his destruction, a smiling, professional cog in the machine that had stripped him of everything. She watched him walk out, his shoulders a little less straight than before. Something about him, about the quiet intensity in his eyes, the story he'd just told the clerk, which she'd overheard, didn't add up. She remembered his hands, the way they had rested on the table, the hands of a maker, a builder. And she remembered something else, a detail she hadn't thought much of at the time. A simple, steel-cased watch on his wrist. It was unremarkable except for one tiny detail she had noticed when he'd reached for a pen, a barely visible inscription on the clasp. Not a name, but a symbol. A stylized bird in flight, with the letter V cleverly integrated into its wing. It was nothing, and yet it was something. A seed of curiosity had been planted in the barren ground of the social services office. A mystery she now felt compelled to solve. While Arthur navigated the harsh realities of his new, impoverished existence, Leo was living in a different universe altogether. A universe he curated and broadcasted for the world to see. The narrator's voice could describe these scenes, painting a stark contrast. We see, through the lens of a social media feed, Leo standing on the deck of a yacht in the Caribbean, a champagne flute in his hand, his arm around a woman whose smile is as bright and artificial as the flash that captures them. The caption reads, "Upgrading the view. #NoLimits #freedom." Another post, a close-up of a ridiculously expensive watch on his wrist, the steering wheel of a new sports car in the background. Time is money. Spend it wisely. #hustle #legacy. The word legacy was a poisoned dart, aimed directly at the heart of the man he'd left behind. Each post was a celebration of consumption, a monument to his own perceived brilliance. He was the hero of his own story, a self-made man who had conveniently erased the first chapter. He never mentioned his father. He never mentioned the $500,000 seed money. In his narrative, he had willed this new life into existence through sheer force of will and superior intellect. The irony was a bitter pill. While Leo posted about building a legacy, Arthur was doing the actual building, albeit on a much smaller, more meaningful scale. Having been turned away by the system, he found refuge in a place that operated on a different currency, compassion. The city's homeless shelter. It was a grim, crowded place, but it was warm and safe. Here, his identity was not a liability. He was just Arthur, one of many men weathered by the storms of life. He didn't speak of his past. He didn't complain about his present. He simply existed, and in his quiet way, he began to contribute. He claimed a corner of the common room, and with a few discarded tools he'd found and carefully restored, he began to fix things. A wobbly table. A door that wouldn't close properly. A set of shelves on the verge of collapse. His hands, those magnificent biographical hands, found their purpose again. The other residents watched him, at first with suspicion, then with a growing respect. They saw the focus in his eyes, the patient, methodical way he worked. He wasn't just fixing objects. He was restoring a small measure of order and dignity to a place that had little of either. The shelter's director, a tired but kind man named Frank, took notice. "You've got a real talent, Arthur," Frank said one evening, watching him perfectly plane a warped piece of wood. "You're a true craftsman." Arthur just shrugged, wiping sawdust from his hands. "It keeps the hands busy," he said. His minimalist response was typical. He sought no praise. He wanted no attention. But in the quiet, desperate world of the shelter, his actions spoke with a deafening clarity. He was a man of substance, a man of value, regardless of the contents of his wallet. He was a builder. He was a maker. He was everything his son pretended to be. One evening, as he was putting the finishing touches on a set of small, hand-carved wooden animals for the children's corner of the shelter, he felt a familiar weight in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was a small, smooth wooden bird, carved from a single piece of maple, its surface worn to a soft patina by years of touch. It was the Vance sparrow, the first prototype, the genesis of everything. He held it in his palm, its weight a comforting anchor to a past he had tried to bury. It was a totem of a different life, a different man. A man of immense power and wealth, yes, but more importantly, a man who knew how to create something from nothing. As he sat there, in the dim light of the shelter's common room, surrounded by the sleeping forms of forgotten men, he felt not despair, but a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. Leo could have the money. He could have the yachts and the watches and the hollow applause of strangers. Arthur had something far more valuable. He had himself, and he was beginning to remember just how much that was worth. The fragile stability Arthur had found within the shelter walls was destined to be short-lived. A sudden flu outbreak forced the shelter into a temporary quarantine, and those who were healthy, like Arthur, were given a small voucher for a week at a local SRO hotel, a single-room occupancy establishment known for its transient residents and unforgiving management. His new home was a tiny box-like room with a single bed, a stained sink, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The landlord was the same Mr. Henderson who had dismissed him weeks earlier. Henderson's eyes lit up with a cruel sort of recognition when he saw Arthur. Well, look what the cat dragged in," he sneered. "Thought I told you to move along. Don't tell me you scrounged up the deposit." Arthur simply handed him the shelter voucher. Henderson snatched it, his expression souring. "A charity case. Figures." The week passed in a blur of lonely silence. Arthur spent his days walking the city, his mind a quiet swirl of memory and resolve. He knew the voucher would run out, and his time in this small, grim room was on a clock. The day the voucher expired, he was a few hours late checking out. He had been helping another elderly resident carry a heavy box down the stairs, a simple act of kindness that had cost him precious time. When he returned to his room, Henderson was there, his face flushed with anger. "That's it. I've had enough of you," the landlord bellowed, his voice echoing in the narrow hallway. He had already gathered Arthur's meager possessions, a small canvas bag containing a change of clothes, his toiletries, and the small wooden bird, and held them in one beefy hand. "You're out, on the street, where you belong." The commotion drew other residents out of their rooms. They stood in their doorways, a silent, weary audience to the unfolding drama. Arthur stood before Henderson, not pleading, not arguing. His face was a mask of calm, his dignity an invisible shield against the landlord's verbal assault. "I was just coming to leave," Arthur said, his voice even. "Yeah, right," Henderson scoffed, shoving the bag into Arthur's chest. "Get your junk and get out of my building, you old bum." He made a show of it, wanting to humiliate Arthur in front of the others, to establish his own petty authority. As Arthur stumbled back, the canvas bag fell from his grasp, spilling its contents onto the worn, dirty carpet. His spare shirt, a toothbrush, and the small wooden sparrow. The bird rolled to a stop near the feet of a young woman who had just entered the lobby. It was Sarah, the bank teller. Driven by a nagging curiosity she couldn't explain, she had spent the last week trying to find him. A friend at the social services office had told her about the shelter, and the shelter director had told her about the SRO. She had arrived just in time to witness this public degradation. Her eyes fell on the small, carved bird on the floor. It was beautifully made, simple yet elegant. As Arthur bent down to retrieve it, his sleeve rode up, and for a fleeting second she saw it again. The clasp of his old watch. And on it, the symbol. A bird in flight, with the letter V in its wing. It was the exact same design as a small, almost imperceptible maker's mark burned into the base of the wooden bird, now lying on the floor. In that instant, 1,000 disparate puzzle pieces began to slam together in her mind. The $500,000 gift. The story of a son's betrayal. The quiet craftsman's hands. The recurring, unique symbol. This was not just a homeless old man. This was someone important. Someone whose story was a secret, a mystery waiting to be unlocked. "Leave him alone," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. Henderson turned to her, his face contorted in a sneer. "And who are you, little lady? His lawyer?" Before she could answer, the entire world outside the grimy front door of the hotel seemed to fall silent. A low, powerful hum replaced the city's cacophony. A long, sleek black sedan, the kind that looks like it's carved from a single piece of polished obsidian, glided to a stop at the curb. Its windows were tinted, its presence radiating an aura of untouchable power. Then a second car just like it pulled up behind it, and a third, a motorcade. The street, a moment ago filled with the noise of traffic and life, was now hushed, all eyes drawn to this impossible, cinematic arrival. The back door of the lead car opened. A polished black shoe, worth more than Henderson's entire suit, was placed firmly on the pavement. A legend was about to step into the light. A man emerged from the car, unfolding himself with the easy, unhurried grace of someone who has never in his life been kept waiting. He was tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than the SRO hotel was worth. His face was instantly recognizable to anyone who followed the world of finance, technology, or philanthropy. It was James Sterling. The James Sterling. The billionaire innovator, the titan of industry, the man who had famously disappeared from public life for a decade only to re-emerge as one of the world's most influential figures. His face, usually a mask of calm, patrician authority on the covers of magazines, was now etched with an expression of intense, focused urgency. He was flanked by two men in dark suits, their eyes sharp and constantly scanning, their professionalism a stark contrast to the grubby lobby they now faced. The very air in the hallway seemed to crackle and change. The residents, Henderson, Sarah, everyone was frozen, caught in the gravitational pull of his presence. Sterling's sharp, intelligent eyes swept over the pathetic scene. The angry, bloated landlord, the shocked onlookers, the scattered belongings on the floor. Then his gaze found Arthur, and everything changed. The hard lines of Sterling's face softened. The immense, world-beating authority drained away, replaced by something raw, vulnerable, and deeply human. It was a look of profound, almost painful respect. A look of relief. A look a man gives when he has found something precious that was thought to be lost forever. "Arthur," Sterling breathed, the name a quiet prayer in the suddenly sacred space of the hotel lobby. He strode forward, his expensive shoes making no sound on the grimy linoleum. He moved with a purpose that parted the small crowd like the Red Sea, his eyes never leaving Arthur's face. He ignored Henderson, who stood gaping, his mouth opening and closing like a beached fish. He ignored Sarah, who was staring, her mind reeling, trying to connect the legendary James Sterling to the destitute old man being evicted. He stopped directly in front of Arthur, his gaze taking in the worn clothes, the tired lines on his old friend's face, the quiet, unbowed dignity that had always been his hallmark. "I've been looking for you," Sterling said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed the world. "For weeks. We lost track of you after you sold the house. We thought—" "Arthur, we were worried." Henderson, finally finding his voice, sputtered, trying to reassert his relevance. Who are you?" "This man is a vagrant. He hasn't paid his rent. I'm evicting him." Sterling didn't even grant him a glance. He raised a single, calm hand, and one of his security men stepped forward, placing a firm, unyielding hand on Henderson's shoulder. The landlord's blustering protests died in his throat, choked off by the silent, absolute authority of the gesture. All that mattered in the universe at that moment was the space between these two men, one in $1,000 suit, the other in clothes from a shelter. One a king of the modern world, the other a pauper. But the reverence, the deep, abiding respect, was flowing in only one direction, from the king to the pauper. Arthur looked at his old friend, a flicker of a weary, long-forgotten smile touching his lips. He bent down slowly, his joints aching, and picked up the small wooden sparrow from the floor. He held it up in his palm. Sterling's eyes locked onto the bird, and a genuine, brilliant smile broke across his face, a smile of shared history, of a secret bond that transcended time and circumstance. "You still have it," Sterling said, his voice filled with wonder. "The first one, the Vance sparrow." He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small, velvet pouch. From it, he produced an identical wooden bird, this one cast in solid platinum, a tiny diamond chip for its eye. "I have one too," he said. "I've carried it every single day for 35 years. To remind me." The pieces clicked into place for Sarah. Vance. The Vance sparrow. Sterling. Sterling Vance Industries. It wasn't possible, but it was happening right in front of her. The quiet old man was not just a forgotten craftsman. He was the Vance, the ghost partner, the legend. James Sterling turned his attention from Arthur for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the small, silent crowd in the lobby. His eyes, now cold and sharp as cut glass, landed on the pale, sweating face of Mr. Henderson. The monologue, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute truth, each word landing with the force of a hammer blow, shattering the reality of everyone present. "You call this man a vagrant?" Sterling began, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "You stand here in your squalid little building, puffed up with your pathetic, transient power, and you dare to cast judgment on him." He took a step closer to the landlord, who seemed to shrink under the intensity of his stare. "This man, this pauper you were so eager to throw onto the street, is Arthur Vance. Does that name mean anything to you?" "No, of course it wouldn't. You're a man who measures worth in late fees and security deposits. You see a frayed collar and assume a frayed character. Let me educate you." The lobby was dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the black cars outside. Sterling's voice rose, filled with a righteous, reverent fury. 35 years ago, when I was a loud-mouthed kid with a business degree and a dream, I had nothing but ideas. Big, flashy, empty ideas. I knew how to sell. But I didn't know how to build. I didn't know how to create. This man, he said, gesturing to Arthur, his voice softening with awe, he knew. He was a genius. Not a loud, ostentatious genius, but a quiet, profound one. He was an artist who worked in wood, in metal, in code. In my garage, with nothing but scrap parts and an intellect that burned brighter than any I have ever known, Arthur Vance designed and built the prototype for the Vance Sparrow navigational core. He held up the platinum bird. This little thing? Its descendants are in every plane that flies, every ship that sails, every satellite that orbits this planet. It is the foundation of a $200 billion global industry. It is the heart of Sterling Vance Industries. The name hung in the air, a sonic boom of recognition. Even Henderson, in his ignorance, had heard of SVI. It was a titan, a legend. He was the Vance, Sterling continued, his voice resonating with history. The silent partner, the soul of the machine. While I was on magazine covers, he was in the workshop, innovating, creating, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. He held more patents in his name by the age of 40 than most scientists do in a lifetime. He was offered fame, fortune, power beyond imagining. And he turned it all down. A look of deep, personal pain crossed Sterling's face. After a family tragedy, he decided he wanted a different life. A quiet life. He walked away from the boardroom, from the billions, from the name. He created a trust, put me in charge of it, and made me swear an oath I would never reveal his identity unless he asked, or unless I believed he was in danger. He wanted to be a carpenter. He wanted to build houses, not empires. He wanted peace. The money you think he doesn't have? His trust generates more in interest every hour than you make in a year. The $550,000 from his house sale, the money he gave to his ungrateful, foolish son, it was a test, a final, heartbreaking test of character. It wasn't his life savings. It was a rounding error in his portfolio. Sterling turned back to Arthur, his expression one of deep apology. I broke my oath, old friend. I'm sorry. But when we saw the house was sold, when we saw the money transferred, and then you disappeared, I feared the worst. Arthur simply shook his head, a gesture of forgiveness. He looked at the stunned faces around him, his own face betraying no emotion, no triumph, no I told you so. He was the same man he had been 5 minutes before. The world around him had changed. He had not. Sterling's gaze returned to Henderson, and it was utterly devoid of mercy. So you see, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. You didn't just try to evict a tenant. You dishonored a giant. You stood on the shoulders of this man every time you used a GPS, every time you bought a ticket for a flight. You just never knew it. Now you do. The revelation was complete. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. The pauper was a king. The landlord was less than nothing. Silence reigned, heavy and absolute. The aftermath of the reveal was a tableau of stunned silence. Mr. Henderson, the landlord, was a statue of shame, his face the color of wet cement. The other residents stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the quiet, handy old man from room 3B with the mythical figure James Sterling had just described. Their simple world of rent and eviction had been invaded by a story of titans and fortunes beyond their comprehension. Sarah, the bank teller, felt a wave of vindication so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. Her instincts had been right. The quiet dignity, the maker's hands, the mysterious symbol, it all made sense now. She had been a witness to the unmasking of a legend. In a suite at a luxury resort thousands of miles away, Leo Vance was scrolling through his phone, annoyed that his post about a new Patek Philippe watch wasn't getting enough likes. Then, a news alert popped up on his screen. Billionaire James Sterling in dramatic public appearance in downtown district. Curious, he clicked. A grainy cell phone video, already going viral, filled his screen. He saw the shabby hotel lobby. He saw the crowd. He saw James Sterling, a man he had only ever seen on TV, his voice ringing with authority. And then he saw his father. He watched, his blood turning to ice, as the story he had never known, the truth he had so carelessly mocked, was laid bare for the entire world to see. The phone slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. The captions on his feed, legacy, self-made, no limits, now seemed like a cruel, pathetic joke. He wasn't a builder of legacies. He was the foolish heir who had spat on a throne he never knew he had. The word pauper echoed in his mind, but now it was an accusation pointed directly at himself. He was the one who was poor. Poor in character, in spirit, in honor. His $500,000 felt like a handful of dust. Back in the lobby, Arthur Vance showed no signs of triumph. He did not look at the shamed landlord. He did not bask in the awestruck gazes of the residents. His honor had been restored, his name cleared, but he took no pleasure in it. The whole spectacle was a painful departure from the quiet life he had so carefully constructed. He looked at James Sterling, and for the first time, a genuine, weary smile touched his lips. It was the smile of two old soldiers who had found each other after a long, lonely war. "It's been too long, James," Arthur said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the charged silence. "That it has, Arthur. That it has," Sterling replied, his own voice thick with relief. "Let's go home." Sterling gently placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder and guided him toward the door, away from the wreckage of his exposed secret. As they passed Sarah, Arthur paused for a fraction of a second. His deep, knowing eyes met hers. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of thanks. For seeing him. For sensing the truth when no one else did. He then turned and walked out of the dingy lobby and into the clean, quiet sanctuary of the waiting car. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing him away from the world that had misjudged him. As the motorcade pulled away from the curb as silently as it had arrived, the narrative began to settle. This was never a story about money. It was a story about the vast, often invisible difference between price and value. Leo knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. Arthur, in his chosen poverty, understood that true wealth lies in the things that cannot be bought or sold. Honor, integrity, peace of mind, and the quiet satisfaction of a life built with one's own hands. The world would talk about the reappearance of the legendary Arthur Vance for weeks. But Arthur himself would be gone, returned to the anonymity he cherished, leaving behind only a powerful lesson. Never judge a man by the simplicity of his clothes, for he may be a king in disguise. And a legacy is not what you leave for people, it's what you leave in people. And for those who had witnessed the events of that day, the lesson was indelible. They had learned that silence can be a sign of immense strength, and humility, the ultimate mark of greatness. For more stories that explore the depths of the human spirit and challenge our perceptions of worth, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. What, in your opinion, is the true measure of a person's legacy? Is it the wealth they accumulate or the character they build? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We read every one. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, remember to look for the greatness hidden in the quiet corners of the world. Subscribe to Justin's Stories for more videos like this. Really appreciate your support.